She sealed a cave home with mica rock. Abram Culloway, 22 years running ore crews through mountain winters without losing a man, told her plainly. When the wind turns north, that pretty wall will kill you before dawn. She had $17, no family in camp, and no way to seal 14 feet of open rock before winter. On January 9th, 1881, the temperature plunged 50 degrees in 14 hours. But 4 months earlier, Letitia Voss Harrow had never framed a wall across open rock in her life. She had arrived in the mica camp above Waynesville 4 months before the cold turned in the last week of August 1880, riding beside her husband on a rented wagon with a cracked axle and $17 folded inside a Bible. Arden Harrow had followed talk of sheet mica and quick money from a played-out lead prospect in eastern Tennessee, and Letitia had followed Arden because that was the shape their life had taken. He was not a miner. He was a man who heard about mining and believed the hearing was enough. The camp sat in a cut between two ridges where Haywood County's mountains broke into narrow valleys thick with poplar, hemlock, and rhododendron so dense it swallowed sound. The mica works occupied a south-facing slope where blast crews had opened 3 ledges into the gneiss and granite, pulling out books of muscovite and sheets that could be split, trimmed, and shipped east for stove windows, lamp chimneys, and electrical insulation plates. It was rough, profitable work. The men who did it lived in framed cabins if they held contracts, in bunkhouse sheds if they labored by the day, and nowhere at all if they owed more than they earned. Arden owed more than he earned within 6 weeks. He bought tools on credit from the camp trader. He promised wagon repairs he could not pay for. He hired hauling help with money that existed only as optimism. And on the 2nd day of October, 1880, he died not in a mine collapse or a blasting accident, but under a runaway sled load of cut timber that broke its chain on a rutted switchback while he stood exactly where no one with sense would stand. 3 men watched it happen. None could reach him in time. The logs struck his chest and the back of his head, and he did not get up. Letitia learned of it from a boy sent running to the wash station where she scrubbed shirts for 2 cents each. The boy said her husband was dead, and then stood waiting as if she might tip him for the news. She buried Arden in the campground the next morning. By afternoon, the debts arrived like creditors at a foreclosure, which is exactly what they were. The camp trader, Sylvan Pike, produced a ledger showing $41 owed for tools, axle work, and hauling advances. The boarding house keeper produced a separate tally for 6 weeks of meals and bunk space. Between them, they claimed the wagon, the mule harness, the bedding, the tool chest, and the camp store credit Arden had drawn against future earnings that no longer had a future. What remained after settlement fit in a single crate: 1 iron cook pot with a cracked handle, 2 wool blankets worn thin enough to read through, a crate of split mica scraps Arden had meant to sell by weight, and $17 in mixed coin that Letitia had kept apart from every transaction her husband made because she had learned years ago that Arden's pockets had no bottoms. The boarding house would not keep her. The keeper said it plainly, not with cruelty, but with the flat voice of a man who had done this before. Bunk space went to working men who produced ore. A widow without family, without labor contract, without a man to vouch for her tenancy, was a liability the camp could not carry into winter. She had until the end of the week. Letitia had no relatives in North Carolina. Her father, a tinsmith and part-time stove repairer who had worked mining settlements across 3 states, had died of pneumonia in Knoxville when she was 19. Her mother had died before that. She had no siblings. She had married Arden Harrow at 21 because he had steady hands and an easy laugh, and because loneliness on the mountain frontier was its own kind of weather. Now she was 29, alone in a camp that had subtracted her husband and everything he touched, and the nearest town with work for a woman was Waynesville, 11 miles down a road that turned to mire and rain and ice and frost, with no wagon to ride and no boarding money at the other end. She could not leave because leaving cost money she did not have and led nowhere she could name. That was the shape of it. $17, no shelter, no labor standing, no family, winter building in the ridge lines like a wall of slate sliding south, and a crate of broken mica that every man in camp considered scrap. Abram Cullowhee found her on the third day after the burial, sitting on an upturned bucket near the mine dump sorting mica scraps by size. He watched her for a full minute before speaking, which was how Abram did most things. He measured before he cut. Abram was the ore road foreman, 53 years old, built like a man who had carried weight uphill for decades and had been compressed by it. 22 winters he had worked Haywood County's high camps. He had supervised 3 winter crew shelters. He had lost 2 mules to a March ice storm on Richland Balsam and never lost a man, which he considered the only credential that mattered. Men in camp trusted his judgment about weather, timber, and survival the way they trusted the grade of a slope, not because he was kind, but because he was usually right. He asked her what she was doing with the mica. Letitia said she was sorting it. He asked her what she was sorting it for. She said she did not know yet. Abram looked at the crate, then at the ridgeline where the first maples were already showing orange. He told her she had maybe 10 weeks before hard freeze. He asked where she planned to winter. She told him about the overhang, half a mile above camp on the same south-facing slope where the blast crews worked. There was a granite shelf that jutted out over a cleared bench of old rubble. She had found it while gathering firewood. The roof was solid rock, 15 feet deep at the center. The floor was rough but level enough. The back wall and side walls were mountain. The opening faced south and caught low winter sun from mid-morning until the ridge shadow took it in late afternoon. Abram's face did not change, but he set down the water jug he was carrying and said he wanted to see it. They walked up together. He said nothing on the trail. When they reached the overhang, he stepped inside, ran his hand along the ceiling stone, kicked at the rubble floor, and stood in the opening looking south. Then he turned and inventoried her failure with the same flat precision the boarding house keeper had used to inventory her debt. The opening, he said, spanned close to 14 feet across. It rose better than 7 feet at the center and tapered to maybe 4 feet at the sides. It faced every downhill wind that poured through the cut after sunset. A man with a crew, 4 men, an ox, and a week of hard cutting could raise a front wall and a roof pitch that might hold through January. Might. If the timber was dry and the chinking was set before the first real freeze and the fire never went out. She had no crew, she had no ox, she had no standing timber claim and no way to fell, haul, and notch enough logs before the mountain turned. Abram said it the way he said everything, without softening, without satisfaction, and without leaving room for hope that was not earned. The mountain, he told her, was not interested in brave ideas. It counted cordwood and wall thickness and hours of burn. It counted warm bodies per square foot and draft per running inch of seam. A south-facing hole in the rock with no front wall was a place to die facing the sun. He paused. Then he added the line that would follow Letitia through every decision she made for the next 3 months. When the wind turns north, Abram Cullowhee said, that pretty wall will kill you before dawn. He meant the wall she had not built yet. He meant any wall she could build alone. He was telling her the math, and the math was fatal. Letitia listened. She did not argue. She watched him walk back down the trail with the heavy, careful step of a man who had delivered similar verdicts before and knew that most of them came true. Then she sat in the opening of the overhang with the afternoon sun on her face and the mica crate between her knees, and she felt what every person in an impossible position eventually feels. Not courage, not inspiration, but the slow, grinding recognition that the only options left are the ones nobody else would choose. The idea did not arrive whole. It arrived in pieces over the course of a week, the way most useful ideas arrive, not as a bolt from heaven, but as a series of small observations that refused to stop connecting. The first piece was warmth. On the 4th morning after Arden's death, Letitia woke in the overhang under both blankets with her fire dead, and her breath visible in the dark. She had banked brush and loose plank sections against part of the opening the night before, but wind had found every gap and turned the shelter into a flue that pulled heat upward and outward as fast as the fire could make it. Her hands ached. Her feet had gone numb twice in the night. She had burned through nearly a third of the scavenged wood she had gathered in 2 days of dragging deadfall. But when the sun came, when the low October sun cleared the eastern ridge and struck the back wall of the overhang at its long morning angle, something happened that she had noticed before without understanding. The stone warmed, not fast, not dramatically. But the granite at the rear of the shelter, dark and dense and angled to catch the light that reached deepest inside, became detectably warmer than the stone in shadow. She pressed her palm to it and held it there. She moved her hand to a shaded section 3 feet away and held it there. The difference was small, but real. By mid-afternoon, with the sun at its lowest autumn arc, the warmth in the stone was unmistakable. The second piece was light. 2 days later, while sorting the mica crate for the 4th time, partly to assess what she had, partly because the work kept her hands moving and her mind from circling, she propped a broad, flat sheet of muscovite against the side of a tin bucket. The mica was flawed, cloudy at one edge, cleaner at the center, maybe 10 inches across. She had set it there to free both hands for smaller scraps, but the sun caught it and something happened that stopped her sorting. Light came through. Not clear light, not window glass light, but a pale, amber-tinted wash of illumination that spilled through the mineral sheet and landed on the rubble behind it in a soft, usable glow. The mica did not block the sun. It filtered it, softened it, and let it pass. She picked up the sheet and held it between her face and the sky. The world behind it was golden and blurred, like looking through creek water in autumn. She could not read through it. She could not see detail, but she could see light. And light meant heat. And heat meant the difference between a shelter that fought winter and a shelter that borrowed from the sun every hour it shone. The third piece was memory. It came that night, unbidden, while she sat near a small fire in the overhang and listened to the wind test the gaps in her makeshift brush wall. Her father. A kitchen in a mining settlement outside Jonesboro, Tennessee. She was 9 or 10. A man had brought a parlor stove with a cracked front window. The isinglass panel had shattered from a log strike. Her father pulled a flat piece of mica from his repair box, trimmed it with tin snips, and fitted it into the stove door frame where the glass had been. She remembered his thumb rubbing dust from the mica's surface until it glowed amber in the lamplight. She remembered the stove door closing, the fire behind it turning the mica into a warm, luminous square, and the heat breathing against her cheeks through a mineral window that did not crack, did not melt, and did not shatter the way ordinary glass shattered around hot iron. He had told her something then. She could not remember the exact words. Something about how mica held heat differently. Something about patience and stone. She remembered his hands. She remembered the smell of hot iron and lamp smoke and the flaky mineral edges where he had trimmed the sheet. She remembered that the mica held. 3 observations. Warm stone in sun, light through mineral, a childhood memory of heat, and a window that did not break. She was not an engineer. She was not a builder. She had never framed a wall across open rock, but she could count, and the count looked like this. If a thick timber wall would stop wind but also stop the sun, and if stopping the sun meant losing the one free source of heat the overhang provided, then a thick timber wall was not the right answer for this specific place. The right answer was something that stopped wind and admitted light, something that sealed the opening without darkening it, something that let the granite do what the granite was already doing, absorb warmth all day and release it slowly after dark. Mica was translucent. Mica tolerated heat. Mica existed in camp by the barrel in irregular, unsellable scraps that miners threw aside because the sheets were too flawed for commercial grade. She was not thinking about single, enormous panes. That would be impossible. She was thinking about surface area, about a timber lattice of narrow vertical bays with cross bracing into which semi-transparent sheets could be layered and lapped and pinned, almost like overlapping shingles set within frames. Outer layer blocks moving air. Inner layer catches what drafts remain. The mica admits winter light. The dark granite absorbs it. By dusk, the interior stone is warmer than the outside air. The task was not to generate heat. The task was to stretch what the sun gave and stop the wind from stealing it. She ran the logic again in the dark while her fire cracked and the wind pushed at her brush wall. The logic held. The materials existed. The physics, as far as she could understand it, worked. What did not work was everything else. She had no frame lumber. She had no sawing help. She had never joined timber to stone. She did not know whether Mica could survive sustained weather exposure without crazing and splitting. She did not know whether the warmth she felt in the back stone on a mild October afternoon would mean anything at all in a January freeze. She did not know if the idea was brilliant or the last bright thought of a woman who would freeze to death believing she was clever. May Carden found her the next morning at the mine dump, pulling mica scraps from the discard pile and stacking them by thickness. May was a cook's helper and ore sorter, 34 years old, wide across the shoulders and narrow in her patience for nonsense. She had come to the camp with her sister's family and earned her keep by feeding men who did not notice her and sorting mineral that other people sold. She was not cruel. She was practical in the way that women in camps learn to be practical. She measured kindness by whether it kept someone alive, not by whether it made them feel better. She looked at Letitia's growing stack of mica sheets. She looked at the timber scraps Letitia had dragged from the slash pile near the lower road. She asked what was happening. Letitia told her. Not the full theory. She did not have language for the full theory yet, but the basic shape. She was going to frame the cave opening with timber bays and fill them with overlapping mica sheets. The wall would block wind and admit light. The stone inside would store warmth from the sun. She would survive winter without a cabin and without enough firewood to feed a conventional shelter. May was quiet for a long time. Then she asked the questions the audience would ask, and she asked them without mockery, which made them harder to dismiss. Would the mica not split when she drove nails through it? Letitia said she would drill, not pound, and pad the pressure points. Would frost not craze the sheets after repeated freeze and thaw cycles? Letitia said she did not know. She said she would layer 2 sheets deep where she could, so if the outer sheet crazed, the inner sheet still blocked air. Would the frame not warp as green wood dried, spilling every sheet? Letitia said she would use the straightest timber she could find and brace tighter than a cabin wall, because the spans were narrow. And even if sunlight warmed the stone by day, May asked, would the cave not bleed every bit of that heat back out before midnight? Would she not simply freeze in better light? Letitia did not have a good answer for that one. She said she believed the stone would hold heat longer than open air, and that stopping wind mattered more than generating warmth. She said the combination, light in, wind out, stone storing what the sun provided, was different from any single element alone. May looked at her. May said she had seen women in camps make decisions like this before, and some of them had worked and most of them had not, and the ones that did not work ended with somebody carrying a body down a trail in February. Letitia said she understood. May said she did not think Letitia understood at all, but that she was going to do it anyway, and that was a different thing from understanding. Then May left. She did not offer to help. She did not wish her luck. She walked back toward the cookhouse with the heavy stride of a woman who had watched enough people make hard choices to know that watching was sometimes all you could do. The gamble crystallized that afternoon. Letitia counted her money on a flat stone beside the overhang and did the arithmetic that would decide whether she lived or died. $17 and some change. Nails by the count, not by the keg, because she could not afford a keg, would cost roughly $4 for the quantity she needed. Lamp-black pitch for ceiling joints, another dollar and change. 2 sawn planks for the main sill, and a header, which she could not cut herself with the tools she had, would cost $3 for the sawing alone if she could find a man willing to do piecework for a widow with no standing. That left $9 for food, candles, and anything she had forgotten, which stretched across 10 weeks of winter meant starvation rations, even if nothing else went wrong. If she spent this money on the mica wall and the wall failed, she could not reverse course. She would have no funds to attempt a conventional shelter. She would have no timber cut, no logs notched, no chinking set. She would have a broken experiment and a frozen death. If she did not spend this money, if she tried instead to build a normal front wall alone, without help, without an ox, without experience, she would run out of time before she ran out of wood. The math on that was just as fatal. Abram had said it plain. Had 4 men in a week, minimum. She had 0 men in 10 weeks. And 10 weeks sounded like abundance until you subtracted the days lost to rain, the days lost to gathering food, the days her hands would be too stiff to work, and the days the mountain simply would not let her climb. She chose the mica, not because she was certain, because the uncertain path was the only path that did not require resources she did not have. She folded the $17 back into the Bible and walked down to Sylvan Pike's supply store to buy nails. Sylvan Pike ran the camp's only general store from a plank-walled shed near the lower road. He sold nails, rope, blasting caps, canned goods, tobacco, and patent medicine at prices that reflected the 11-mile distance to Waynesville and his monopoly's comfort with that distance. He also bought distressed claims, tools, and future wages at fractions of their value, because men who were broke today would accept terms tomorrow that they would have spit at last week. He had offered Letitia half value for the mica scrap crate the week Arden died. She had refused. He had not forgotten. Pike was 46, narrow through the face, and owned the kind of smile that arrived at his mouth without reaching anything above it. He was not a frontier villain in the theatrical sense. He was a man who understood that other people's emergencies were his inventory, and he managed that inventory with the same care a good merchant manages any stock. When Letitia came through the door and asked for nails by count, Pike looked at her the way a storekeeper looks at someone he has already appraised and found unprofitable. She asked for 60-penny nails, 8-penny nails, and small brads, counted out in quantities she read from a list written on the back of a flour receipt. Pike sorted them slowly. He asked what she was building. She said a wall. He asked what kind of wall needed brads and 80-penny nails in the same purchase. She said the kind she was building. Pike set the nails on the counter and named the price. Then he leaned forward on both hands and asked the question he had been saving since she walked in. Was she buying nails for a coffin or a greenhouse? The store had 2 other men in it. They heard. That was the point. Letitia said neither. She said she wanted a wall that worked. Pike laughed. It was not a large laugh, but it carried. He said walls were made of timber, not shine. He said he had sold supplies to men in these mountains for 11 years, and he had never once sold brads to a woman who thought she could build her way through January with a crate of mineral scraps. He said if she wanted to survive winter, she should sell him the mica at the price he had already offered, take the money, and walk to Waynesville while the road was still passable. Letitia counted coins onto the counter with hands dirty from mica dust. She counted them twice to make sure the total was exact. She put the nails in her apron pocket. She thanked him for his time. She walked out. Behind her, Pike said something to the two men that she could not hear and did not need to hear. She knew the shape of it. She had heard men explain women's foolishness to each other in that same confidential tone her entire life. It was the sound of a door closing, not on a room, but on the possibility that anyone in camp would take her seriously after today. She carried the nails up the trail to the overhang. Each one weighed almost nothing. Together they weighed enough to feel like a decision that could not be taken back. Construction began the next morning in the kind of cold, clear October light that made the mountains look closer than they were. Letitia cleared the cave mouth first. She dragged loose rubble away from the sill line, swept smaller stones with a branch broom, and marked the base of the opening with charcoal and a length of hemp string borrowed from a discarded ore sack. The opening measured just under 14 feet across at the base and just over 7 feet at the center of the arch. The sides tapered unevenly. The left side dropped to about 4.5 feet, the right to barely 4. The irregularity meant nothing she built could be perfectly square. Every joint would need fitting. Every brace would need trimming. Every timber would need to be read against the stone it touched. She had decided on 5 bays, not because 5 was elegant, but because 5 was manageable. Each bay would span roughly 2.5 to 3 feet wide, narrow enough that she could brace them individually without needing lumber heavy enough to require a second pair of hands. The 2 sawn planks, the sill board and the header, would run the full width of the opening. Vertical posts between them would divide the space. Cross-bracing within each bay would hold the mica sheets in place. The design was modular, which meant she could build one bay at a time, test it, and adjust before committing to the next. The first day she squared the sill line and anchored the base plank against the stone floor, using wedge cuts and gravity. The work was slow. The stone was uneven. Every time she thought the plank was level, she found a new high spot that tilted it. She shimmed, reset, shimmed again. By late afternoon, her back ached from crouching, and her fingers were scraped raw from handling rough-cut timber against granite. She had built nothing visible. She had laid one board on the ground, but the board was level, and level was the foundation everything else would stand on. And she knew, the way her father had known, the way anyone who worked with their hands eventually knew, that the work you could not see was the work that held. The second day, she began cutting vertical posts from scavenged saplings and discarded plank ends. She had no proper saw. She had a hand hatchet, a draw knife she had pulled from the slash pile and resharpened on a creek stone, and patience that functioned as a substitute for equipment. Each post took more than an hour to cut, trim, and fit. By the end of the second day, she had 3 posts standing, braced temporarily with rope and stone. The third day, the first post fell. She had not set it deep enough into the sill notch, and an overnight wind gust caught the unsupported top and torqued it sideways. She found it in the morning lying across the rubble with the rope trailing behind it like a leash on a dog that had run. She stood it back up, cut the notch deeper, reset it, and braced it with the diagonal timber she had not planned on using yet. The fix cost her half a day and most of her remaining rope. The mountain did not care about her schedule. The maples on the eastern ridge were shedding their last leaves. Frost stayed later each morning. The ore crews had begun talking about cutting firewood in earnest, which meant the slash piles and deadfall near camp would be picked clean within weeks. Every cord of easy wood that disappeared was a cord Letitia could not gather for the small fire she would still need on the coldest nights, even if the mica wall worked. By the end of the first week, she had the main frame standing, 5 bays, rough but upright, braced against the cave mouth like the skeleton of something that might become a wall or might become proof that Abram Cullowhee was right. The frame looked fragile. The bays gaped. Wind poured through every opening as if the wood were not there at all. Men passed on the trail above and looked down into the cut. Most said nothing. One said she was hanging church windows on a bear den. Another, A younger teamster, who laughed easily at things he did not understand, said she was building a lantern for freezing in public. The joke that stuck, the one that moved through camp the way useful cruelties always move, passed from mouth to mouth until it belonged to everyone and no one, was shorter. She's building herself a glass grave. Letitia heard it twice before the week was out. She heard it spoken directly once, by a man whose name she did not know, standing near the cookhouse with a plate of beans. She heard it repeated once, by a woman in the wash line who did not realize Letitia was 3 tubs down. She did not answer either time. She went back to the overhang and trimmed the rabbet on the second bay deeper so the next mica slab would sit tighter against the frame. The work was the answer. The work was the only answer she had. Have you ever built something that everyone around you thought was foolish? Tell us in the comments, what did they say? And did you keep building? The nails were bought. The frame was rising. The mica sat in its crate, waiting to be cut and seated into bays that had never held anything but wind. Frost crept lower each morning. Sylvan Pike's prediction hung over the camp like weather. And somewhere above the tree line, winter was not approaching. It was already there, leaning on the ridge, waiting for the moment the mountains stopped pretending October was safe. Letitia had $9 left. She had 5 empty bays. She had no mentor, no help, and no evidence that a wall of stone light would stop anything at all. She had the frame. She had the mica. She had the memory of her father's hands fitting mineral into iron while the fire burned behind it and did not break through. She did not have enough. She had never had enough. But she had stopped counting what was missing and started counting what remained, and that arithmetic, the arithmetic of what she could still do with what she still had, was the only math that pointed forward instead of down. The first mica sheet went into the second bay on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of October. She drilled the pilot holes with a hand-awl, patted the mounting points with strips of leather cut from a ruined belt, and pressed the cloudy, amber-tinted sheet into its frame with hands that shook from cold and from something she would not have called fear, but that lived in the same part of her chest. The sheet held. Light came through it. The stone behind it caught the sun. And high above the camp, the wind shifted, and the temperature dropped 3 degrees before noon, and the season took one more step toward the test that would prove whether the glass grave was a grave or something else entirely. The second bay's mica sheet held through the night. Letitia checked it at first light, pressing her fingers to the edges where leather padding met the frame stops, feeling for movement. The sheet had not cracked. The mounting points had not shifted. Wind had tested the gaps around the sheet and found them. She could feel cold threads of air along the bottom edge, where the mica did not quite meet the crossbrace, but the sheet itself sat firm. Light came through it in the same pale amber wash she had seen the day before. Only now the light carried the angle of late October morning, lower and more direct, reaching deeper into the overhang than it had in September. She stood inside the cave and looked at the single-filled bay among 4 empty ones. 1 panel of filtered sunlight. 4 open rectangles of wind and cold. The ratio was the problem stated in physical form. She needed to fill every bay before the season closed the window for outdoor handwork, and filling each bay required drilling, fitting, padding, and trimming that took hours she could measure against the frost line that crept lower down the ridge each morning. She began the 3rd bay that afternoon and broke the first large mica sheet within an hour. The break was her fault. She had been trimming the edge with tin snips to fit the bay width, working too fast because the light was failing and her hands were stiff. The snips caught a flaw line in the muscovite, a hairline fracture invisible on the surface but running through the crystal plane like a crack in ice, and the sheet split diagonally from corner to center. The 2 pieces fell apart in her hands with a sound like a plate breaking in another room, clean, final. She sat on the rubble floor and looked at the 2 useless halves. The sheet had been one of the larger pieces in the crate, nearly 12 inches across, clean enough to admit real light. Replacing it meant sorting through the remaining scraps for another sheet of similar size, and similar size was not common in a crate of mine waste. The good sheets were going first. The remaining inventory was smaller, cloudier, and more fractured with each piece she pulled. She could not afford to break another one. That night, she warmed the next candidate sheet near her cook fire for 20 minutes before handling it. Not hot, just warm enough that the mineral lost its brittleness and flexed slightly under hand pressure instead of snapping. The difference was small but real. When she trimmed the warm sheet the next morning, the snips cut clean and the fracture lines stayed quiet. She filed that lesson alongside the drilling and the leather padding. Each piece of knowledge cost something: a broken sheet, a lost afternoon, a night of doubt, but the cost was the tuition, and the curriculum was the wall. Tobin Gannett appeared on the 4th day of the 3rd week, not because anyone sent him and not because he was looking for charity. He appeared because he was walking the upper trail to inspect a culvert he had set for the mine drainage the previous spring, and the trail passed above the overhang, and what he saw from above stopped him the way a wrong note stops a musician. He stood on the trail looking down at Letitia's frame for perhaps 2 full minutes. Then he came down the slope sideways, favoring his left leg, which had been bad since a scaffold collapse in a quarry outside Asheville 11 years earlier. He was 56 years old, thick through the chest and thin through the patience, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same stone he spent his life cutting. He had been a stonemason for 30 years before the leg broke his ability to climb. Now he shaped hearths, retaining walls, culverts, and chimney bases for the camps when drink allowed steadier work, which was most weeks but not all of them. He did not introduce himself. He walked to the sillboard, crouched, slowly, with the bad leg extended, and ran his thumb along the joint where timber met stone. Then he looked at the drainage gap she had left at the base of the sill. He looked at the south-facing orientation. He looked at the way she had braced the vertical posts with diagonal supports that transferred load into the cave walls rather than depending on the sill alone. He asked who taught her to leave drainage at the sill. Letitia said nobody. She said water pooled at the base of every barn and shed she had ever seen that lacked it, and pooled water froze, and frozen water moved things that were not meant to move. Tobin stood up. He did not look at her. He looked at the wall. He said the drainage was correct. He said the bracing angle was close to correct but could be improved. He said the sill joint was going to fail before January because she had fitted timber against raw stone without reading the stone's high points. And raw stone always had high points that rocked a board like a chair with one short leg. He picked up a scrap of charcoal from her fire ring, rubbed it on the bottom edge of a loose post, pressed the post against the stone where it would eventually stand, and lifted it away. The charcoal had transferred to the stone surface in an uneven smear. The high spots were visible, 3 small ridges where the granite rose above the plane. He said if she knocked those ridges down with a cold chisel or even a heavy nail set, the post would sit flat and stay flat. He said this method, soot marking, fitting, marking again, was how every decent mason read irregular stone. He said it was the difference between a joint that held and a joint that waited for weather to teach it a lesson. Letitia watched him. She did not ask him to stay. She did not offer him anything. She waited. Tobin looked at the mica sheets stacked against the cave wall. He picked one up and held it to the light. He turned it. He tapped it once with a blunt fingernail and listened to the sound. He asked what she was putting in the bays. She told him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked why. She told him that too. The sunlight, the stone, the wind. The logic she had built from observation and the memory of her father's hands. Tobin set the mica sheet down and looked at the opening and the sky beyond it. He said he had set furnace fronts and chimney breasts for 20 years, and he had never heard of anyone framing mica into a wall for winter shelter. He said the idea sounded like something that would work in a man's head and fail in a man's hands. But he did not leave. He crouched again beside the sill and pressed his thumb into the joint where her second bay's mica sheet met the cross brace. He felt the pressure, tested the flex, and said the mounting was better than he expected, but the padding was wrong. Leather compressed under sustained load. It would thin over weeks and let the sheet rattle loose. She needed cloth behind the leather, something that would not compress as far, and pitch over the cloth to seal the gap against air. She said she had pitch. He said he knew she had pitch. He said pitch and cold was useless. It thickened into stone and would not spread. She needed to warm it inside a tin, apply it warm with a flat stick, and let it set in place before it cooled past working temperature. She asked how long the working window was. "About as long as it takes to ruin it," Tobin said. Then he almost smiled, and the almost was more than anyone in camp had offered her since Arden died. He came back the next day with a cold chisel, a mason's mallet, and a tin of his own pitch that he had mixed with pine tar for flexibility. He did not say he was helping. He said he wanted to see whether the mica held against a proper frame set. The distinction mattered to him. He was not rescuing a widow. He was testing a proposition. The partnership, because that is what it became, slowly and without declaration, changed the pace of everything. Tobin taught through demonstration, not lecture. He crouched beside the sill and made Letitia read soot marks until she could identify a high spot by sight before marking it. He made her hold a mica plate against low sun and watch how far the light reached into the overhang at different hours, then mark the stone floor where sunlight landed at noon, at 2, at 4. She learned the shelter's light map the way a farmer learns the shadow pattern of a barn, by standing in it and paying attention. His third teaching was the most important and the hardest to learn. He told her that the stone inside the cave was not furniture, it was fuel. Dark, dense granite stored warmth, the way a cast iron stove stored warmth. Slowly, silently, and for hours after the source was gone. But it only stored what it received. Random rubble scattered across the cave floor wasted the sun's energy on surfaces that did not matter. She needed to move stone. She needed to stack dark, heavy pieces where the afternoon sun actually landed, against the back wall, along the floor in the light path, anywhere the soot marks on her light map showed sustained exposure. The stacked stone became a battery. The mica wall became the window that charged it. He made her do the moving by hand. He stood against the cave wall and pointed. She hauled granite cobbles and flat slabs into position, stacking them in low courses where the sun reached deepest. Her shoulders burned. Her fingers cracked from stone dust and cold. Tobin did not help with the hauling. His leg would not allow it. But he corrected her placement with a grunt or a pointed finger, and when she set a stone where it caught full sun, he said nothing, which was his version of approval. By the end of the second week of collaboration, the overhang had changed. 3 bays were fully seated with mica sheets, double-layered in the center bay where wind struck hardest, single-layered in the flanking bays. The interior stone stack rose 18 inches high against the back wall in a rough arc that followed the afternoon light line. Letitia could stand inside on a sunny afternoon and feel the difference against her skin. The air near the stone stack was warmer than the air near the open bays. Not dramatically, not comfortably, but measurably, undeniably warmer. The 4th bay went in during the first week of November. The 5th bay, the highest, the most exposed, the one that closed the last remaining gap at the arch's peak, was the problem. The arch peak was irregular. The stone curved and jutted in ways that no straight timber could follow. Letitia needed to shape the header to match the granite, which meant scribing the stone's profile onto the wood and cutting to fit. She had never done this. Tobin had done it 1,000 times. He talked her through it while she held the header board against the arch, and he marked the stone's outline onto the wood with charcoal, working from a seated position on a rubble stack because his leg would not let him stand and reach overhead. The first cut was wrong. The header sat crooked and left a 2-inch gap on the left side, where wind would pour through like water through a broken dam. Letitia stared at it. Tobin told her to mark it again, cut again, and stop expecting Stone to apologize for being Stone. The second cut was close. The third was right. The header seated against the arch with less than a 1/2-inch gap across its full width, and Tobin packed the remaining gaps with fiber, cloth, and pitch, while Letitia held the board in place from below. The fifth bay received its mica sheets on the 14th of November, 1880. The wall was complete. Complete. The word sat strangely in the air because the wall did not look like anything the camp had a name for. It was not a cabin front. It was not a window. It was not glass, and it was not stone, and it was not timber, but it was all three at once, a lattice of rough-cut wood holding overlapping plates of cloudy, amber-tinted mineral that caught the morning light and turned the cave mouth into something that glowed. From outside, in full sun, the wall looked like a lantern built into the rock. The mica sheets ranged from nearly transparent at their centers to smoky and opaque at their edges, and the light that passed through them was not the hard, clear light of glass, but a soft, diffused warmth that filled the overhang without sharp shadows. From inside, looking out, the world beyond the wall was a pale golden blur, shapes without detail, brightness without glare, the mountain reduced to light and color and movement like a painting seen through creek water. Letitia's first full day with the wall closed was the 15th of November. She woke to filtered light instead of wind. The air inside the overhang was still cold. She could see her breath, but it was not the attacking cold of open exposure. It was still cold, held cold, cold that sat instead of moved. And by mid-morning, when the sun cleared the eastern ridge and struck the mica wall at its full autumn angle, the interior began to change. The stone stack warmed first. She pressed her palm to it by 10 o'clock and felt heat, real, unmistakable heat, as if someone had laid a warm iron on the surface and walked away. By noon, the air pocket between the stone stack and the back wall was warmer than any interior space she had occupied since the boarding house. By 2 o'clock, with the sun at its lowest arc driving light deep into the overhang, the effect was startling. She sat against the back wall and felt warmth against her shoulders through her coat. Water she had left in a tin cup near the stone stack stayed liquid when water in May Carden's cookhouse shack, 50 yards downslope, with 4 plank walls and a stove, had crusted with ice near the door. She marked these small victories the way a debtor marks payments, relief without celebration, because the debt was still enormous, and the creditor was January. Abram Cullowhee came on the 17th of November. He did not announce himself. He walked up the trail, ducked under the header board, and stood inside the overhang for a full minute without speaking. He felt the air. He felt the stone. He looked at the mica wall from inside, where the light came through in that strange amber wash, and he looked at the frame joints and the drainage and the interior stack. Then he said the draft was less than he expected. That was all. Less than he expected. He did not say it was good. He did not say it would hold. He said the noon of a November day in a mild autumn was not January. He said January did not care about bright midday warmth. January cared about what happened between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the sun was 12 hours gone and the stone had given back everything it had, and the cold pressed in through every imperfection in every joint like water, finding the bottom of a hill. He left. Letitia watched him go. She did not argue with his assessment because his assessment was not wrong. The wall had proven it could admit light and block some wind on a fair day. It had not proven it could sustain warmth through a killing night. That test was still coming, and every degree the temperature dropped brought it closer. December arrived with the sound of axes. The camp's firewood consumption doubled as temperatures fell and daylight contracted. Men who had stacked 4 cords in October now realized they needed 8. Slash piles disappeared. Deadfall within easy distance was stripped. Teams pushed deeper into the timber, which meant longer hauls, which meant more labor, which meant less time for everything else. The economy of the camp subtracted from itself in the way winter economies always subtract. Every resource spent on staying warm was a resource not spent on staying fed, staying equipped, staying ahead. Letitia watched the subtraction from her overhang. She burned less wood than any shelter in camp. Her small fire, maintained in a shallow pit near the cave mouth where smoke drew naturally toward the opening, served as supplement, not lifeline. On sunny days, she let it die by mid-morning and relied on the stone stack and the sealed wall to hold the interior above freezing. On cloudy days, she fed it enough to keep the air from biting. Her wood consumption was perhaps a quarter of what a similar-sized cabin would demand, and even that fraction felt like luxury because every stick she did not burn was a stick she did not have to find, drag, split, and stack while the mountain tried to kill her. Tobin noticed. He said the wood math was the part that would eventually convince people because the mountain did not argue with opinion. It argued with cord counts. If she burned a quarter of what the cabins burned and stayed as warm or warmer, the mountain was making her argument for her. But December also brought the first real test of the wall's night performance, and the test was not kind. On the night of December 3rd, the temperature dropped below 0 for the first time that season. Letitia woke at 1 a.m. to a sound she had not heard before, a quiet, irregular ticking from the mica wall, like someone tapping a fingernail against crockery. The sheets were flexing. Thermal contraction in the wood frame was pulling at mounting points. Frost feathered at the edges of the outermost sheets where warm interior air met freezing exterior air, and the moisture crystallized into delicate fern patterns that would have been beautiful if they had not represented failure. She got up. She lit the lamp. She moved from bay to bay, pressing her palm against each sheet, feeling for active air leaks. Bay 2 was solid. Bay 3 had a whisper of cold at the bottom edge, where the sill pitch had contracted and cracked. Bay 4, the center bay, double-layered, held firm. Bay 5, the arch bay, had developed a gap at the top where the header had shifted a fraction of an inch against the irregular stone. She sealed the Bay 3 crack with warmed pitch and cloth. She packed the Bay 5 gap with twisted fiber and pressed it into place with a flat stick. The repairs took 20 minutes. Her hands shook from cold and from the awareness that the wall was not a finished thing. It was a living system that moved with temperature and weather and required attention the way a fire required fuel. By morning, the interior had cooled to a temperature she guessed was in the low 20s. Uncomfortable, but not dangerous if she stayed under blankets and kept the fire banked. Outside, the camp reported single digits. In the bunkhouse sheds, men had slept in their coats with boots on. In the boarding house, the stove had been fed every 90 minutes through the night. Letitia had fed her fire twice. She added the data to the ledger she was keeping in her head, not written because paper was money and money was food, but tracked with the precision of someone who understood that survival was an accounting problem. Warm days. The wall exceeded expectations. Cold nights. The wall declined but held. Single-digit nights. The wall required active maintenance and supplemental fire, but consumed dramatically less fuel than any conventional shelter in camp. The question that remained, the question Abram had asked and the mountain had not yet answered, was what happened when the temperature did not merely drop below 0, but crashed below 0, fast and hard and violent in the kind of cold snap that arrived once or twice a winter in these mountains and turned comfortable cold into killing cold in hours. That question hung through December like a held breath. January opened mild. The 3rd through the 6th were almost warm. Afternoon temperatures climbed into the upper 30s. Mud replaced ice on the ore road, and men worked in shirt sleeves past noon. The mildness felt generous, which was the mountain's oldest trick. Generosity in early January was a credit advance against a debt that would come due with interest. On the afternoon of January 8th, Tobin climbed to the overhang and sat on the stone stack where the afternoon sun had warmed it to the temperature of a living body. He said the barometer at the mine office had been falling since morning. He said the air tasted like metal, which was something his father had told him about weather changing fast, and his father had been right often enough to make the taste worth noting. He told Letitia to fill every container she had with water before dark. He told her to gather whatever wood she could carry in one trip and stack it inside the cave, not outside. He told her to check every bay joint, every pitch seal, every leather pad, and every fiber packing in the wall before she slept. She asked how bad he thought it would be. Tobin said he did not know. He said the barometer said bad, and his knees said worse. She checked the wall. She hauled water. She dragged 2 armloads of wood inside and stacked them near the fire pit. She checked every bay from inside and outside, pressing, feeling, patching one small gap in Bay 3, where the December repair had loosened slightly. She positioned her blankets on the sleeping shelf Tobin had helped her build. A flat stone platform raised 8 inches off the floor at the deepest point of the overhang, where residual warmth from the stone stack radiated longest. That evening, the sun set into a sky the color of a bruise. The temperature at dusk was 34 degrees. By midnight, it was 11 degrees. By 2 in the morning, it was 4 below zero. By the time the sky began to lighten on January 9th, 1881, the temperature at the mine office thermometer read 19 below zero. The drop was more than 50 degrees in fewer than 14 hours. The wind came from the north, driving through the cut between the ridges like a saw blade through soft wood. Trees on the exposed western slope popped and cracked from sap freezing in their trunks. The ore road, which had been mud that afternoon, turned to iron and then to something harder than iron, a surface that would not accept a boot heel or a hoof and would not yield until spring. Breath froze on beards. Water left in buckets near cabin doors became solid before dawn, and every gap in every wall in every structure in camp became a mouth through which the cold could speak. Letitia woke in the dark to the sound of the wall talking, not breaking, not cracking, talking. The mica sheets ticked and flexed in their frames. The timber creaked as it contracted. The pitch in the joints made small popping sounds as it stiffened and shrank. The wall was a system under stress, and every component expressed that stress in its own voice, a quiet, continuous language of thermal contraction that filled the overhang with a murmur like insects in dry grass. She lay under both blankets on the stone shelf and listened. The air on her face was cold, truly cold. Not the held cold of November, but a pressed, advancing cold that felt like it had weight. But the air was still. It did not move. The wall was holding wind, and the absence of moving air was the difference between cold you could survive under blankets and cold that pulled heat from your body faster than your body could make it. She got up. She lit the lamp. The flame burned steady, which meant no significant draft. She moved from bay to bay as she had done in December, pressing her palm to each sheet, testing each mounting point. Bay 1, solid. The mica ticked but held. No active air leak. Bay 2, solid. Frost on the outer surface, dry on the inner. Bay 3, a thin whistle of air at the left bottom corner where the frame met the cave wall. She packed it with cloth and pressed pitch against it with her thumbnail. Bay 4, the double-layered center bay was rigid and quiet. The air gap between the two mica layers was acting as insulation, and both sheets were intact. Bay 5, the arch bay. The header had shifted again, the same gap she had fixed in December, open now by more aggressive contraction. She packed it again, tighter, using a folded strip of blanket edge pressed into the gap with a stick. The stone stack radiated warmth she could feel against her shins when she crouched beside it. The granite had absorbed a full afternoon of January sun, weak sun, low-angle sun, but sun that had driven through the mica for 5 hours, and the stone was releasing it into the cave air in a slow, steady pour that would not run out for hours. She built the fire, small. Not for heating the room was being heated by stone, but for warming her hands and boiling water for the work ahead. At 3 a.m, Tobin arrived. He came up the trail in the dark, with a lamp in one hand and a walking stick in the other, his bad leg swinging wide on the frozen path. He was breathing hard when he ducked through the cave mouth. He stood inside for a moment, feeling the air, and said one word. Warm. Not warm the way a cabin with a roaring stove was warm. Warm relative to the killing air outside. Warm enough that his breath, which had plumed thick and white on the trail, thinned inside the overhang to a faint haze. Warm enough that the frost on his beard began to melt. The interior was perhaps 30 degrees, maybe a few degrees above, maybe a few below. Cold enough to be uncomfortable. Not cold enough to be dangerous. Outside, it was 19 below zero and falling. He asked about the wall. She showed him the repairs. He pressed his own hands to the bays, testing, listening. He said the wall was doing what a wall should do. It was working, and working was not the same as surviving, and surviving was what the next 6 hours would determine. At 4 a.m, May Carden came. She came not for herself, but carrying a child, her sister's boy, Davy, 7 years old, wrapped in a coat and a blanket, and shaking with fever and a cough that sounded like something tearing inside his chest. May's sister's cabin had lost its stovepipe connection 2 hours earlier. The pipe had contracted, shifted, and separated at a joint, filling the cabin with smoke. They had tried to refit it in the dark and failed. The cabin was now a choice between smoke and cold, and neither choice was safe for a sick child. May did not ask permission. She came through the cave mouth with Davy in her arms and sat against the stone stack and held him there where the warmth from the granite pressed against his back through the blanket. The boy's shivering slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. The difference between violent shaking and manageable trembling, which was the difference between a body losing its fight and a body still in the fight. Letitia brought water. Tobin stoked the fire higher than Letitia usually kept it, wasteful, but the child needed warmth faster than the stone could deliver it alone. May looked at the mica wall and the amber light of the lamp passing through the sheets, and the frost on the outside surfaces and the dry, still air inside, and she said nothing because nothing was the first stage of understanding when the thing you doubted turns out to work. By 5 a.m, the crisis had become communal. 2 miners from a smaller plank shelter below the ore road arrived at the cave mouth. Their shack had begun to fail, every board seam whistled with wind, and their fire could not keep pace with the infiltration. They had burned through their night's wood supply by 3 a.m. and had nothing left but the furniture. One of them had frozen toes inside his boots. They did not beg. They stood at the entrance and asked whether there was room. There was room. The overhang was not large, but it was not a cabin either. The space ran 15 feet deep, and the width of the opening provided enough floor for 8 or 10 people if they sat close. Letitia let them in. They sat against the cave walls and felt the air and looked at the mica wall and said nothing for a long time. At 6, the wind intensified. The wall began to sound different, not the quiet ticking of thermal contraction, but a deeper, rhythmic flexing as gusts struck the mica sheets and pushed them inward against their stops. The sound was the wall breathing under pressure, each gust an inhalation that bent the sheets a fraction of an inch before the frame's resistance pushed them back. Bay 4 held perfectly. The double layer was rigid enough to absorb wind force without significant flex. Bays 1 and 2 flexed, but held. Bay 3, the bay that had given trouble since December, developed a new whisper of air at its upper right corner. Bay 5 failed, not catastrophically, not the shattering collapse that Abram Kolowi had predicted, but the header gap, the same gap, the chronic gap, the gap that existed because irregular stone and straight timber could never perfectly marry, opened under a sustained gust and stayed open. The fiber packing she had pressed in at midnight loosened and dropped. Cold air entered the overhang in a focused stream that hit the sleeping shelf and the people near it like a blade. If you're invested in what happens next, whether one failing bay brings down everything she built, hit subscribe and stay with us, because the next hour changes everything. The temperature inside the overhang dropped 3 degrees in minutes. The child cried. May pulled him closer. The two miners looked at the gap, and then at Letitia with the expression of men who had just watched their shelter begin to die. Letitia stood under the arch bay and looked up at the gap. It was less than 2 inches wide, and perhaps 8 inches long. Through it she could see the night sky, starless and black with cloud. Cold poured through it with a sound like someone blowing across the mouth of a bottle. She could seal it from inside by climbing the rubble stack and pressing material into the gap overhead. But sealing from inside meant working against gravity with cold, stiffened hands in the dark, and the gap was positioned where the header met the most irregular section of the arch, the section that had required 3 cuts to fit, the section that had never been perfect because perfection in stone did not negotiate. She could open the bay from inside by removing the mica sheets and reseating the header, but opening the bay meant removing the only barrier between that section of the wall and the full force of the wind, and at 19 below zero with a sick child in the shelter, opening even one bay could drop the interior temperature past the point of recovery before she could close it again. Tobin spoke from beside the fire. He did not stand. He could not climb the rubble stack with his leg, but his voice was steady and his instructions were specific. "Do not open the bay," he said. "Seal from inside. Use the blanket strip she had used before, but fold it tighter, 4 layers, not 2. Press it in with the flat stick and then wedge a timber scrap behind it to hold it against the stone." The wedge did not need to be elegant. It needed to be tight. Letitia climbed the rubble stack. Her feet slipped twice on frost-slick stone. She braced one hand against the arch ceiling and reached into the gap with the other, pressing the folded blanket strip into the space between header and stone. The cold air fought her. It pushed the fabric back, curled around her fingers, numbed them in seconds. She pressed harder. She fitted the timber scrap behind the fabric and hammered it once with the heel of her palm. The whistle stopped. The stream of cold air thinned to nothing. The gap was sealed, not beautifully, not permanently, but completely enough that the wind's voice disappeared from the shelter. She climbed down. Her hands were white and shaking. Tobin said she had done it right. He said next time she should use pitch behind the wedge to freeze it in place. She said there would not be a next time tonight. He said there was always a next time. The shelter held. Through the rest of the night, through the worst hours, between 2 and 5 in the morning when the cold pressed hardest and the stone stack stored warmth ebbed toward its lowest point, the shelter held. The air inside cooled further. Breath was visible in the lamplight, thick white clouds that drifted upward and pooled near the ceiling. The stone stack's surface temperature fell from warm to cool to merely not cold. But the mica wall denied the wind direct entry, and without wind the cold could only press, not penetrate. It could lower the temperature, but it could not attack the bodies inside the way it attacked bodies in the open or in shelters where every seam was a highway for moving air. By 6 in the morning, when the sky began to lighten but the temperature had not yet begun to rise, Letitia counted the people in the overhang. Herself, Tobin, May, and Davy, the 2 miners. An old woman from the sorting shed who had arrived sometime around 5, led by one of the miners who had gone to check on her. 7 people in a cave sealed with stone light. At 8, the sun appeared. The effect was immediate and almost violent in its contrast. Light struck the mica wall and poured through it in a flood of amber warmth that lit the cave interior like a church window at dawn. The stone stack, dark granite that had spent the night slowly surrendering its stored heat, began to recharge. Within an hour, the surface temperature of the back wall had risen enough that the old woman from the sorting shed pressed both hands to it and held them there with an expression that had no words. By mid-morning, the interior air near the stone stack was warm enough that the men removed their coats. The child stopped coughing long enough to sleep. Sunlight reached the deepest point of the overhang and heated stone that would hold that heat until well after dark. One of the miners, a man named Elias Treat, who had spent the night sitting against the cave wall in silence, stood in the warm light near the back wall and said he had never felt anything like this in a shelter without a stove. Then Abram Cullowhee arrived. He came up the trail in daylight, squinting against the glare of sun on frost. He ducked through the cave mouth and stood inside. He looked at the mica wall, at the light pouring through it, at the stone stack radiating warmth, at the 7 people sitting in a cave that should have killed them all, and instead had kept them alive while better-built shelters failed. He felt the air with his open hand. He felt the stone. He looked at the wall from inside, where the amber light softened every surface, and the frost on the outer mica sheets glittered like sugar while the inner surfaces stayed dry. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, not to Letitia, but to the room, that he had judged the mountain right and the woman wrong. Then he stopped and corrected himself. He said he had judged the woman wrong and the mountain not completely. It was not an apology. It was not praise. It was a recalibration, the closest thing to admission that a man like Abram Cullowhee could produce, and Letitia accepted it the way she accepted everything the mountain gave her, without ceremony, without triumph, and without the illusion that one right answer meant the questions were finished. Outside, the temperature was still 14 below zero. Inside, light came through stone, and the stone remembered the sun, and the people who had called it a glass grave were holding their hands to its warmth in silence. The cold held for 3 more days. On the morning of January 12th, the temperature climbed above zero for the first time since the 8th, and by afternoon it had reached the low 20s, still bitter by any lowland standard, but warm enough that the camp exhaled. Men emerged from shelters they had not left in 70 hours. The ore road softened enough to accept boot prints. Smoke from cook fires rose straight instead of shearing sideways in the wind. Letitia spent that first mild morning repairing the bay 5-header gap properly. She pulled the emergency packing, cleaned the joint with a flat stick, warmed pitch in a tin over her fire, and applied it to both surfaces, header and stone, while Tobin watched from his seat on the rubble stack and said nothing except once, when she missed a corner, and then he said only the corner's name. Left side. She caught it. The pitch set firm. The gap closed for good. Then she went back inside and sat against the stone stack and slept for 4 hours in daylight, which was the first time she had slept longer than 90 minutes at a stretch since the night of the 8th. The stone was warm against her back. The Mica wall filtered the January sun into the same pale amber light it always made. Someone had left a cup of water near the back wall, and it was not frozen. These were small facts. They were also the entire argument. The validation began not with praise, but with questions, which was the more honest currency. Elias Treat came back the afternoon of the 12th. He was the miner who had sheltered in the overhang during the crisis, and who had said he had never felt anything like it in a shelter without a stove. He came alone, without the pretense of emergency, and he stood in the cave mouth and asked Letitia whether he could look at the wall from outside. She said yes. He walked the full width of the front, touching the mica sheets through the frame, running his fingers along the pitch joints, crouching at the sill to see the drainage gap. He asked how the sheets were mounted. She showed him the leather pads, the drilled holes, the cross-brace stops. He asked why some bays had 2 layers and some had 1. She explained the wind exposure logic, double where the gust force was strongest, single where the cave walls provided side protection. He asked whether the method could work on a flat wall, not a cave opening. Letitia said she did not know. She said the overhang provided a roof and side walls that a flat wall would not have. But the principles, light admitted, wind blocked, dark stone storing heat inside the shelter line, those did not require a cave. They required south-facing exposure and enough mass inside to absorb what the sun gave. Treat thought about this. Then he asked what the sheets cost. Letitia said the sheets cost nothing. They were mine waste. They were the scraps that every crew in camp threw into the dump pile because the pieces were too flawed, too small, or too irregular for commercial shipping grade. She had pulled them from the discard pile with her own hands, sorted them by size, and trimmed them to fit. Treat looked at the dump pile visible from the cave mouth, a low mound of broken mica, quartz rubble, and blast waste that the mine crews added to weekly. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has walked past 100 times without seeing. He left without saying much else. But he came back 2 days later with a plank and asked Letitia to show him how to drill a mica sheet without splitting it. May Carden's conversion happened differently. It happened through the child. Davy, May's sister's boy, had stayed in the overhang through the worst of the cold snap because his fever had not broken, and the family cabin stovepipe remained unfixed for 2 days after the crisis. May had come and gone, bringing food and taking reports, but the boy had stayed on the stone shelf under both of Letitia's blankets with his back against the warm granite. On the 3rd day, his fever broke. He woke clear-headed and hungry and complained about the light, which was the first sign of recovery that meant anything. May sat beside him and held his hand and looked at the cave wall, really looked at it, the way she had not looked during the crisis because the crisis had been about survival, not architecture. And she said something that Letitia remembered for the rest of her life. She said she had thought Letitia was building a grave. She said she had been wrong about what Letitia was building, but she had not been wrong to worry, because the difference between a grave and a shelter was sometimes just the weather's mood, and nobody could know which mood the weather would choose. Then she said she wanted to learn how to sort mica by clarity grade, because the cookhouse windows were oiled paper, and oiled paper was a miserable excuse for a window in any season. It was not an apology. May did not apologize. It was something more useful. It was a practical woman deciding that a practical thing had earned her attention. She began coming to the overhang in the afternoons, after her kitchen duties, and sorting mica scraps from the dump pile into 3 piles, clear enough for light, cloudy enough for windbreak, and too damaged for either. She washed the usable sheets with creek water and a rag because dirty mica blocked light the way dirty glass blocked light, and admitted light was the entire point. Letitia taught her the trimming. She taught her the warming trick. Heat the sheet gently before cutting. She taught her the pressure logic. Drill, never pound, pad, never press bare. Seat with room for movement, never lock rigid. May learned the way May did everything, quickly, silently, and without wasting motion on words that did not carry weight. Within a week, May had built a small mica storm panel for the cookhouse's south-facing window opening. It was crude, 4 sheets of middling clarity lapped and pinned into a plank frame with leather padding and pitch seals. But light came through it. And the cookhouse, which had always been dark on the side that faced the weather, now had a square of amber glow near the stove that warmed the air pocket beside it, enough that the cook noticed and the cook told the camp owner, and the camp owner came to look. That was the beginning of the spread. Not a proclamation, not a public conversion, a cookhouse window that worked. Sylvan Pike heard about the cookhouse window before the end of the week. His reaction was not conversion, it was calculation. He came to the overhang on a Tuesday, the first time he had climbed the trail since Letitia had bought nails from him in October. He walked the front of the mica wall, touched nothing, and asked how many sheets of commercial-grade mica the wall contained. Letitia said none. She said every sheet in the wall was mine waste that no buyer would accept. Pike asked whether the same method could be applied using commercial-grade sheets, which were clearer, larger, and more uniform. Letitia said it could, but there was no reason to waste good sheets when scrap worked fine. Pike smiled. It was the same smile that had never reached his eyes, a mouth gesture that signaled the arrival of a proposition, not pleasure. He said he had been thinking about the market value of what she had demonstrated. He said a man with access to sheet mica and a knowledge of framing could sell winter front panels to camps, farms, and settlements across the mountain counties. He said he was prepared to offer her a partnership, his capital, his supply connections, his existing trade network. She would teach the method. He would sell it. They would split the revenue. He said the word partnership the way a man says partnership when he means ownership with a friendlier name. Letitia said no. Pike's smile did not change, but his voice did. He said she was making a mistake. He said knowledge without capital was a hobby. He said if she continued giving the method away for free, teaching anyone who asked, sorting scrap mica for anyone who carried a frame, she would have nothing to show for it by spring except a reputation for charity and an empty purse. Letitia said she already had an empty purse. She said the purse was not the point. Pike left. He did not threaten. He did not need to. The threat was structural. In a camp where he controlled supply, credit, and trade, a woman who refused his terms was a woman who had chosen to operate outside the only economy that mattered. He could not stop her from teaching, but he could make teaching cost her small denials, delayed credit, scarce supplies priced higher when she came to buy. She understood this. She taught anyway. Because the method was not a product. It was a set of observations about light, wind, stone, and heat that belonged to the physics of the mountain, not to any person who happened to notice them first. Selling it would have been like selling the south-facing exposure itself. The mountain owned that. She had only learned to use it. Tobin and Letitia worked through the rest of January and into February with the focused energy of people who had proven one thing and now wanted to prove the next. The crisis had validated the wall's survival capability. What remained was understanding its limits and extending its uses. They disagreed for the first time on the 19th of January, and the disagreement mattered because it revealed different philosophies shaped by different lifetimes of working with stone and heat. Tobin wanted to add a second interior wall, a low partition of dry stacked stone running parallel to the mica front, about 3 feet inside it. The partition would create a dead air space between the mica wall and the living space, adding insulation and reducing the rate at which the interior cooled after sunset. He had built similar partitions in furnace rooms where heat retention mattered, and the principle was sound. Letitia said no. She said the partition would block the light path. The sun entered through the mica at a low winter angle, and reached the back wall only because the interior was open. A 3-foot stone wall in the middle of that path would cast a shadow across the stone stack for 3 hours of the afternoon, exactly the hours when the granite absorbed its deepest charge. The insulation benefit of the partition would be real, but the heat gathering penalty would be larger. Tobin said she was wrong. He said insulation was always worth the cost. She said insulation was worth the cost in a system that generated its own heat. A stove, a furnace, a fire pit, those systems made heat and wanted to keep it. Her system did not make heat. It gathered heat from the sun and stored it in stone. Anything that reduced the gathering was a net loss, even if it improved the keeping. They argued about it for 2 days. Not with raised voices, neither of them raised their voices about work, but with the stubborn, detailed persistence of people who each believed they were right and who respected the other enough to keep explaining instead of walking away. On the 3rd day, Tobin conceded, not with words. He arrived at the overhang, looked at the light falling unobstructed on the stone stack at noon, and said he would build the partition half height instead, 18 inches, not 3 feet. That would create a partial air gap at floor level where cold pooled worst without blocking the light path above. Letitia looked at the half-height proposal and said she would accept it if the top surface was dark stone, flat enough to absorb direct sun. That way the partition itself became additional thermal mass rather than just insulation. Tobin stared at her. Then he said something she had never heard him say to anyone. He said she was thinking like a mason. They built the partition together over the next week. It was the first time they worked as genuine equals, not teacher and student, not mentor and protege, but 2 people with different expertise solving the same problem through compromise. Tobin cut and shaped the stone. Letitia placed each piece according to her light map, rotating flat dark surfaces upward where the sun would find them. The finished partition rose 18 inches from the floor in a gentle arc that followed the overhang's shape, and by the end of the first sunny day after completion, every flat stone on its top surface was warm to the touch. February was a working month. The cold persisted, but the crises did not repeat at the same intensity, and the shelter performed with the quiet consistency that Letitia had learned to trust more than any dramatic proof. She maintained the wall, checking joints weekly, reapplying pitch where thermal cycling cracked it, replacing one mica sheet in Bay 2 that had developed a fracture line after 8 weeks of flexing. The replacement was routine. She warmed the new sheet, drilled pilot holes, seated it in its stops, and sealed the edges. The whole repair took 40 minutes. 3 months earlier, it would have taken a full day and most of her confidence. Tobin's health had been declining since before the crisis, though he had hidden it with the particular stubbornness of men who have spent their lives working through pain. The bad leg was old news. The new problem was his chest. He coughed in the mornings, not the productive, clearing cough of a man shaking off sleep, but a dry, grinding cough that came from deeper than his throat and left him winded. He blamed stone dust. 30 years of cutting, shaping, and setting stone in enclosed spaces had lined his lungs with the same mineral he had spent his life mastering. The mountain gave, and the mountain took, and sometimes it gave and took the same thing. He did not talk about the cough. Letitia did not ask about it. They talked instead about improvements to the shelter, about heat distribution, about whether a dark cloth hung behind the mica wall on the sunniest bay would absorb additional warmth and radiate it inward. They tested the cloth. It worked. Letitia added it to her inventory of techniques, another small lesson that emerged from collaboration and would outlast the collaborator. In early March, Tobin climbed to the overhang on a morning warm enough that the mica wall was almost unnecessary, the kind of late winter day that previewed spring without committing to it. He sat on the stone stack, which was warm from the previous afternoon's sun, and looked at the shelter with an expression Letitia had not seen before. It was not satisfaction. It was something quieter. Recognition, maybe. The look of a man seeing something finished that he had helped begin. He told her he was going to stop coming up the trail. His leg and his chest between them had made the climb more punishment than his body would accept. He said he would be available in camp if she needed advice, but the work of the shelter was hers now, and it had been hers for a while, and the only reason he had kept coming was that he liked the view from the stone stack in the afternoon. She asked him if he was all right. He said he was not all right. He said he had not been all right for some years, and that being not all right was a condition he had learned to manage the way she had learned to manage a wall of mica, by checking the joints regularly and patching what cracked. She did not press. She knew the shape of what he was saying, the way she knew the shape of the stone in the arch, by feel, by pattern, by the places where the surface did not quite match what you wanted it to be. Tobin came to the overhang one more time. It was in the last week of March, on a day when the sun was strong enough that the interior felt like May, and the stone stack radiated heat you could lean against like a warm animal. He sat in his usual spot. He looked at the wall and at the improvements she had made since his last visit, the cloth backing, a new drainage channel at the sill, a stone bench positioned in the afternoon light path for sitting. She had changed the shelter again without asking him. He said that was the right thing. He said what she had built was never a cave front. It was a habit of looking at heat correctly. And a habit did not need permission. It needed practice. He died in the second week of April, in his bunk in camp, from a chest that had finally stopped accepting the terms he had offered it. May told Letitia in the morning. Letitia walked to the overhang and sat on the stone stack where Tobin had sat, and pressed her hands to the warm granite and held them there until the warmth felt like something she could keep. The mountain light came through the mica wall and filled the cave with the same amber glow it always made. And the stone held the heat the way stone always held the heat, patiently, without asking for anything in return, long after the source was gone. The secondary crisis arrived in November of 1881, 10 months after the January freeze that had proved the shelter, and 5 weeks after Tobin's death had forced Letitia to carry the method alone. The autumn had been wet. 3 weeks of intermittent rain through October had soaked every woodpile in camp, stacked cords that men had cut and dried through. The summer sat in mud and absorbed water through their end grain until the wood was heavier, harder to split, and reluctant to burn. A sudden freeze in the first week of November locked the moisture inside. The camp woke to find its primary winter fuel supply compromised. Wet wood burned smoky, slow, and cold. It produced half the heat of dry wood and twice the creosote, which clogged stovepipes and chimney flues and created the conditions for the fires that every camp feared more than cold. The shortage was not total. Some men had kept their wood under cover. Some had cut late and stored dry. But the margin between sufficient fuel and insufficient fuel in a mountain winter camp was never wide, and 3 weeks of rain had erased it for perhaps a third of the shelters in the district. Letitia understood the crisis before most of the camp did because she had spent a year thinking about heat as a system rather than a commodity. Wet wood was not just a fuel problem, it was a cascade. Wet wood burned poorly, which meant colder shelters, which meant more wood burned per hour, which meant the wet supply depleted faster, which meant the shortage arrived sooner and harder than the raw numbers predicted. The math was self-reinforcing. Every bad hour made the next hour worse. She went to Abram first, not because she needed his permission, but because his authority could move the camp faster than her reputation could. She told him what she proposed: temporary mica storm panels for the worst affected shelters, interior stone warming stacks where south-facing exposure existed, and the conversion of an empty storage cut near the lower road into a communal daytime warming room, a space where families with failed wood piles could sit in solar-heated stone warmth during the day and reduce their nighttime fuel demand to survivable levels. Abram listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he asked how many mica sheets the dump pile could supply. She said enough. The mine had been producing waste mica for 3 years. The dump pile held more scrap than the camp could use in a decade. The limiting factor was not material. It was framing lumber, labor, and time. Abram said he could supply framing lumber from the mine timber stores if she told him the dimensions. He said he could assign 2 men from the ore road crew for 3 days if she directed the work. He did not say these things generously. He said them the way a foreman allocates resources, because the allocation solved a problem, and problems unsolved became problems compounded. Within a week, Letitia was directing construction she had not designed for shelters she had not built, using techniques she had developed in one cave and was now translating across a dozen different structures. Each application was different. A plank cabin's south-facing window needed a frame that mounted to sawn lumber, not stone. A bunkhouse windbreak needed to cover a wider span with less structural support. The communal warming room, the storage cut, which had a south-facing opening similar to her own overhang but wider and shallower, needed a multi-bay front that admitted maximum light across a broader wall. She taught as she built. She showed the assigned workers how to drill mica without splitting it, how to warm brittle sheets before trimming, how to pad mounting points and seal joints with pitch and cloth. She showed them the light map principle: stand inside, mark where the sun lands, stack dark stone in that path. She used the same language Tobin had used on her: fit, seat, movement, draft, storage, release. The words came out of her mouth in his voice, and she let them, because the voice was the lesson, and the lesson was what mattered. May worked beside her through the entire effort. She sorted mica. She trimmed sheets. She taught the warming trick to women in the sorting sheds who had never handled the mineral as anything but ore to be weighed and shipped. The 2 of them, the widow who built a glass grave and the cook's helper who had said it would kill her, became the paired hands of a method that neither of them fully owned and both of them fully understood. Sylvan Pike watched the effort from his store. He watched Letitia teach for free. He watched men carry scrap mica that had no commercial value and turn it into shelter components that reduced their dependence on the fuel he sold at winter prices. He watched his own economic logic. Scarcity creates demand. Demand creates price. Price creates profit, undermined by a woman who gave away knowledge the way the sun gave away light, without a ledger and without a bill. His first move was predictable. He raised the price of dry firewood by 40%, arguing that scarcity justified the increase. The camp grumbled but paid, because men with wet wood piles and cold families did not negotiate well. His second move was subtler. He offered nails, pitch, and framing lumber at cost, not free, but at his wholesale price, eliminating his margin to anyone building mica storm panels. The gesture looked generous. It was positioning. If the method spread, Pike wanted to be the man who supplied its materials. If he could not own the knowledge, he would own the supply chain. Letitia said nothing about it. She did not need to. The method's material requirements were small enough that most families could scavenge what they needed without visiting Pike's store at all. The mica was free mine waste. The framing was salvage lumber. The pitch could be gathered from pine stumps. The nails were the only item that required purchase, and nails at cost were nails at cost regardless of the motive behind the pricing. Pike's generosity cost him margin and bought him nothing. The camp took his nails and thanked him, and continued learning from Letitia. It was the first time his commercial instincts had failed him completely, and the failure was visible to everyone who watched. If this story reminds you that the most valuable knowledge is the kind that is given freely, share it with someone who needs to hear it. By the end of November, the fuel crisis had stabilized, not because the wet wood had dried, drying took months, but because the camp's heat economy had changed. 7 shelters now had mica storm panels on their south-facing openings. The communal warming room operated daily, heated entirely by sun and stone, reducing daytime fuel demand across the camp by an amount that Abram estimated at 2 cords per week. Women who had never considered the direction their cabin faced now asked Letitia whether a window opening could be cut in a south wall, and how large, and what grade of mica to use. The camp had not adopted a technology. It had adopted a way of seeing. South-facing exposure was no longer dead wall space to be boarded over for warmth. It was an asset. Dark stone inside a shelter was no longer rubble to be cleared. It was storage. Wind was no longer a problem to be solved only by mass and thickness. It was a problem to be solved by sealing, by stopping the air's movement rather than resisting its temperature. Letitia had not invented these principles. The sun and the stone had always behaved this way. She had only been desperate enough to notice. The winter of 1881 to 82 was not as dramatic as the first. No single crisis matched the January 9th freeze. But the cumulative effect of the method's spread was visible in a dozen small ways that added up to something larger than any one of them. Less wood burned. Fewer stovepipe failures because less creosote accumulated in flues that worked less hard. Fewer frozen water supplies inside shelters. Fewer mornings when men woke in coats and boots because the fire had died and the cabin had surrendered. The camp's relationship to winter had shifted from pure combat to something more like negotiation. Still hard, still cold, still demanding, but no longer a fight that could only be won by burning more. Letitia maintained and improved her own shelter through the season. She added removable interior shutters for the worst nights, hinged plank panels that could be swung across the mica bays to add a third layer of wind resistance when temperatures dropped below zero. The shutters blocked light but retained heat, and she opened them each morning when the sun returned, creating a daily rhythm of closing for the night and opening for the day that became as automatic as banking a fire. She experimented with mica clarity grades. She found that cleaner, more transparent sheets admitted more light and therefore more heat, but also lost more warmth at night because they were thinner and offered less wind resistance. Cloudier, thicker sheets admitted less light, but blocked wind more effectively. The optimal arrangement was what she had stumbled into by necessity during the first construction. Clear sheets where light mattered most, cloudy sheets where windbreak mattered more. But now she understood the trade-off well enough to teach it as principle rather than accident. She built a stone bench inside the overhang, positioned in the afternoon light path where the sun struck the floor for 3 hours before retreating behind the ridge. The bench seated 3 people. On cold afternoons, the stone surface warmed enough that sitting on it felt like sitting near a stove. Women from the sorting sheds came to sit there during breaks. Children came after their morning chores. The bench became a gathering point, a place where warmth existed without fuel, and where the price of admission was walking up the trail. The overhang was no longer a survival shelter. It was a room, a workshop, a school, a place where the method lived in visible, touchable form, and where anyone who wanted to learn could come and press their hand to warm stone and understand in their skin what words could only approximate. Letitia stood in it some evenings after the visitors had gone, and the light had faded, and the stone stack was giving back the last of the day's warmth, and she thought about Tobin sitting in his usual spot with his bad leg extended and his hands on the granite, and his voice saying things she now said to other people in the same tone he had used with her. The shelter held his voice the way it held heat, not forever, but long enough to matter, and longer than you would expect from something built of stone and mineral and light. By the spring of 1882, Letitia Voss Harrow had been in the Mica camp above Waynesville for 20 months. She had arrived as a widow with $17 and a crate of mineral scraps. She had survived a winter that had tested every shelter in the district and broken several. She had taught a method that reduced fuel consumption, improved shelter warmth, and changed the way the camp thought about south-facing walls, dark stone, and the mineral waste that 3 years of mining had piled into a mound nobody valued. She was no longer the woman the camp meant to expel. She was the woman the camp sent people to when winter made them honest. The shift was visible in small, countable ways. 9 shelters in the district carried some version of her ideas by the third winter. Mica storm panels on cookhouse windows, double-layered windbreak fronts on bunkhouse south walls, stone warming stacks positioned inside the light path of whatever opening faced the low winter sun. Not all of them worked equally well. Some were poorly framed, with loose joints that leaked air and mica sheets that cracked in the first hard freeze. Some were mounted on north-facing walls where the sun never reached, which proved only that the installer had learned the technique without understanding the principle. But the ones that worked, the ones that faced south, sealed tight, and stored heat in dark stone, those shelters burned less wood, held more warmth, and survived cold snaps with a margin of comfort that their neighbors could see, measure, and envy. Letitia's days had a shape now that would have been unrecognizable to the woman who had sat on an upturned bucket sorting mica scraps in October of 1880. Mornings she maintained her own shelter, checking joints, replacing cracked pitch, rotating mica sheets that had weathered unevenly. Midday she taught. Anyone who climbed the trail could learn. She showed them the same things in the same order: orientation first, sealing second, mass third, face south, stop the wind, stack dark stone where the sun lands. The 3 rules were simple enough that a child could remember them and complex enough that a carpenter could spend a season getting them right. Afternoons she worked on improvements: the removable shutters, the clarity grade sorting, the cloth backing that absorbed additional heat behind the mica. Each improvement was small. None of them were dramatic. Together they represented a body of knowledge that had been built the way the shelter itself had been built, one piece at a time, tested against weather, corrected by failure, and refined until the method felt less like an invention and more like a conversation with the mountain that the mountain had been willing to have all along. She was not wealthy. Teaching paid nothing. The camp still operated on Sylvan Pike's economy of credit, supply, and small extortions. But she ate. She stayed warm. She had standing. Women who had pitied her now brought damaged frames for repair. Men who had laughed at the glass grave now asked whether a mica panel could be cut to fit a wagon's side opening for winter hauling. Children from the sorting shed sat on the stone bench in the afternoon light and did not think of it as remarkable, which was the deepest form of success, the kind where the innovation disappears into ordinary life and nobody remembers a time before it. Jonah Beale arrived in the camp in late March of 1882, driving a mule and a wagon loaded with iron stock, barrel hoops, and a portable forge that rode on the tailgate like a squat black toad. He was 31, built for work the way a hammer is built for work, compact, dense, and shaped by the thing he did most. He had been a blacksmith's assistant in Greenville, Tennessee, before a disagreement with the smith over wages had put him on the road with his tools and his temper and not much else. The camp needed iron work, stovepipe repairs, hinge replacements, tool sharpening, sled runner straightening. The accumulated metal damage of a mountain winter created steady demand for anyone who could heat iron and hit it accurately. Jonah set up his forge near the lower road, hung a piece of flat iron from a post as a calling sign, and began taking work within 2 days. He heard about the Mica wall within the first week. Everyone in camp had an opinion about it, and opinions traveled faster than ore wagons on a downhill grade. Some men described it with admiration. Some described it with the residual skepticism of people who had been wrong and preferred not to discuss it. Sylvan Pike described it with the careful neutrality of a man who had tried to buy something he could not and had not forgiven the refusal. Jonah climbed the trail to see it himself on a cool April morning when the overhang was empty except for Letitia and the light. He stood in the cave mouth and looked at the wall the way Tobin had looked at it the first time, not at the mica or the light, but at the joints, the frame, the points where wood met stone and wood met wood, and the method either held or failed. He asked who had built it. Letitia said she had. He asked who had set the header against the arch. She said she had, with help from a mason who was dead. He looked at the header joint, the one that had given her trouble through 2 winters, the one she had repaired and repacked and repitched until the gap no longer opened. He said the joint was ugly. He said it was also the strongest part of the frame because it had been fixed so many times that the accumulated packing and pitch had created a composite seal that would outlast the timber around it. Letitia said she had not planned it that way. Jonah said most of the strongest things he had ever seen in ironwork were things that had been repaired until the repair was better than the original. He said failure was just practice that left marks. She looked at him. He looked at the wall. Neither of them said anything else for a while, which was the beginning of something neither of them named for several months. The partnership, the real one, not the commercial arrangement Pike had proposed, formed through work, not declaration. Jonah's contribution was specific and immediate: hinges. Letitia's removable interior shutters had been hung on leather strap hinges that stretched and sagged after repeated use. Jonah forged iron strap hinges that swung true and held position and could be mounted with bolts he made himself on the portable forge. The shutters became precise instruments instead of approximate ones. They closed flush. They opened flat. They lasted. He also made her a set of tools she had never had: a proper hand drill with a hardened bit for mica work, a flat pitch knife with a blade thin enough to spread warm pitch into hairline cracks, and a pair of trimming shears sharper and more controllable than the tin snips she had been using since October of 1880. Each tool solved a problem she had been working around since the beginning, and each one arrived without fanfare, left on the stone bench in the morning, or handed to her during work with a grunt that served as both presentation and instruction. She did not thank him elaborately. She used the tools. She used them well. He noticed. That was the currency. They argued about improvements the way she and Tobin had argued about the partition, with detail, with stubbornness, and with the underlying respect that made stubbornness productive instead of destructive. Jonah wanted to add iron brackets to the frame joints to prevent the thermal movement that had plagued the wall since its first winter. Letitia said rigidity was the wrong approach. The wall survived because it moved. Mica flexed, wood contracted and expanded. Pitch cracked and was resealed. The system worked because it accommodated change, not because it resisted it. Iron brackets would transfer stress to the mica sheets instead of absorbing it, and the sheets would break. Jonah said she was wrong. She said she was not wrong. They tested both approaches on a spare bay that Letitia had framed as a practice panel. Jonah mounted iron brackets on the corners. Within 2 weeks of freeze-thaw cycling, the bracketed bay cracked a mica sheet along the stress line where the bracket held the frame rigid against stone that wanted to move. Jonah removed the brackets. He did not apologize. He said the wall was smarter than he was about this particular thing, and that most things he worked with, iron, steel, brass, wanted to be held still, and it was going to take him time to learn that mica wanted to be held gently. Letitia said that was the first intelligent thing she had heard a blacksmith say about stone. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and the sound was unexpected, not loud, but real, a short exhalation that came from actual amusement rather than social performance. She found herself wanting to hear it again, which was a feeling she had not had about another person's sound since Arden was alive, and that recognition surprised her enough that she went quiet for the rest of the afternoon. They were married in the fall of 1882, in a ceremony performed by a circuit preacher who arrived in camp on the same day as a shipment of blasting caps, and seemed uncertain which delivery the camp was more excited about. The wedding was brief. The witnesses were May Carden and Abram Cullowhee, and a handful of others who had earned their presence through the long winter and the longer spring. Letitia wore her work clothes because she had no others, and because vanity about clothing had been one of the first things the mountain had burned out of her. They lived in the overhang, which Jonah expanded over the following year by extending the mica wall 2 bays wider to cover a natural alcove on the eastern side that had previously been open to weather. The alcove became their private space, a room within the room, separated from the main shelter by the half-height partition that Tobin had proposed and Letitia had redesigned. The expansion used better materials and cleaner technique than the original wall, but Letitia insisted on keeping the original 5 bays as they were, patched, repitched, scarred by 2 winters of thermal cycling, and still transmitting light through the same cloudy mineral sheets she had mounted with shaking hands in October of 1880. The original wall was not a monument. It was evidence. It was proof that the thing everyone said would fail had not failed, and the proof was more convincing imperfect than it would have been replaced. Sylvan Pike's reckoning came in the winter of 1882 to 83, and it came not through moral transformation, but through structural failure, which was the only language Pike truly understood. His storehouse annex, the addition he had built on the cheap the previous spring to expand his inventory space, had been framed fast with green lumber that was still drying when the first frost hit. By December the boards had shrunk, opening seams across the south and west walls that admitted cold air in steady, invisible streams. The merchandise closest to the walls, patent medicines, canned goods, ink, and the bound ledger books that contained every debt in camp, began to suffer. Ink froze in bottles. Canned goods expanded and split. The ledger pages curled from moisture cycling. Pike tried to seal the seams himself. He packed them with oakum and tar. The oakum shrank as it dried. The tar cracked in the cold. He repacked. The seams reopened. He was fighting the same physics that Letitia had spent 2 years learning to work with rather than against. And he was losing because he approached the problem the way he approached everything, by buying a solution and applying it by force. In the second week of January, after a cold snap that was not as severe as the freeze of 1881, but was persistent enough to make every flaw in every structure audible, Pike walked up the trail to the overhang. He came alone. He came in the afternoon when the mica wall was doing its most visible work, and the interior was warm enough that the contrast with the cold outside was impossible to deny. He did not look at Letitia. He looked at the wall. He studied it the way a merchant studies a competitor's inventory, not with admiration, but with the focused assessment of a man calculating cost, application, and margin. Then he turned to Letitia and said he needed a storm panel for his storehouse annex. He said the south wall had a window opening that was currently boarded over. He said if the opening were fitted with a mica panel, the light and heat gain might be enough to stabilize the interior temperature and protect his goods. He said he would pay full price for materials and labor. Letitia looked at him. She remembered the nail counter. She remembered the question, coffin or greenhouse. She remembered the smile that never reached his eyes and the laughter that was meant to be heard by others. She remembered the word partnership spoken in the voice of a man who meant ownership. She remembered the price he had raised on dry wood while families with wet wood piles burned furniture to keep their children warm. She said she would build the panel. Pike looked surprised, then relieved, then suspicious in rapid sequence. She said she would build it at the same price she charged everyone, which was no price at all. The Mica was free mine waste. The labor was hers. She would not take his money because taking his money would make them even, and they were not even, and she did not want the ledger to look like they were. Pike opened his mouth and closed it. He was a man who had spent his life managing transactions, and a transaction that refused to be a transaction left him without footing. He could not owe her. He could not pay her. He could stand in her shelter and feel the warmth he had predicted would kill her and accept the help he had tried to prevent her from giving anyone else. And that acceptance was its own price, paid in the only currency she valued, the knowledge that he knew, and she knew, and everyone in camp would know, that the woman he had mocked at the nail counter had built something his money could not buy and his ridicule could not break. She built the panel in 2 days. She used mid-grade mica, properly framed, with the cloth backing for heat absorption and pitch seals at every joint. She mounted it herself on Pike's south wall while he stood behind her and watched and said nothing. When she finished, the afternoon sun came through the panel and lit the storehouse interior with the same amber warmth that lit her overhang, and the air near the south wall rose in temperature enough that Pike's ink bottles would not freeze and his ledger pages would not curl. He paid her anyway. He left coins on the bench outside the storehouse door, full price for materials she had not charged for and labor she had refused to bill. She found them the next morning. She left them there. May Carden found them the morning after that and used them to buy flour for the cookhouse, which was the most appropriate destination for Sylvan Pike's money that anyone could have devised. Pike never thanked her. He never acknowledged publicly that the panel worked, but he never again raised the price of firewood above market rate during a shortage, and he never again laughed at a woman carrying mica scraps up a trail. The silence was his conversion, and Letitia accepted it the way the mountain accepted everything, without ceremony and without the expectation that what had changed would be announced. The years after the second winter compressed the way frontier years always compressed, not because nothing happened, but because what happened became rhythmic instead of dramatic. Seasons turned, the shelter improved, the method spread. Letitia and Jonah had a daughter in the fall of 1883, born in the overhang on the stone shelf where Letitia had survived the January freeze delivered by May Carden's hands while the mica wall filtered September sunlight into the room and the stone was warm against the girl's first skin. They named her Marin, which was Letitia's mother's name and sounded like the mountain. The camp changed around them in the ways that camps change when an extraction economy matures. The mica market shifted. Sheet quality requirements tightened. Some crews moved to richer ledges in Jackson County. Others stayed and diversified. Feldspar, kaolin, small timber operations. The population fluctuated. New families arrived. Old ones left. But the shelters that Letitia had taught people to build remained, and the principles she had demonstrated continued to inform how new construction faced the sun, how stone was placed inside walls, and how winter was met with something other than raw fuel and raw fear. Letitia taught through 2 more winters after the daughter's birth. She taught less formally by then, not because the demand had faded, but because the knowledge had diffused into the camp's ordinary life. Women sorted mica without being asked. Men who framed new shelters oriented south-facing openings wider than they used to and narrower on the north. The language she and Tobin had used, fit, seat, movement, draft, storage, release, had entered the camp's working vocabulary the way any useful language enters use, by being needed, repeated, and eventually forgotten as something anyone had to be told. She stopped climbing the trail to teach in 1885, when Marin was 2 and a second child was expected, and the walk to the overhang from the expanded shelter felt longer than it used to. By then her knees held the same complaint that Tobin's had held, not the dramatic failure of an injury, but the accumulative protest of joints that had spent too many hours crouching on stone. She taught from the bench instead, sitting in the afternoon light with her daughter on her lap and her hands shaping Mica, the way her father's hands had shaped Mica in that kitchen in Jonesboro when she was 9, and the world was a stove door and a warm amber square of light. Jonah's forge prospered. He made hinges, hardware, stove parts, and the occasional specialized tool that Letitia designed and he built, a mica scoring blade that cut cleaner than shears, a pitch knife with a curved tip for reaching recessed joints, a set of mounting pins that could be driven without a drill. They were a partnership in the way that her outline had always imagined partnerships, formed through work, sustained by argument, and held together by the shared conviction that making things correctly was a moral position, not just a practical one. Abram Cullowhee retired from the ore road in 1884, his knees and his patience both worn past the point of daily use. He stayed in camp. He came to the overhang on winter afternoons and sat on the stone bench in the sun and said little, which was his natural state and his most comfortable one. He never repeated the line he had spoken on the trail in October of 1880, the line about the wall killing her before dawn. He did not need to. Everyone who had been in camp that winter remembered it, and the remembering was enough. May Carden married a teamster from Buncombe County in 1883 and moved to a farm near Asheville, where she installed a mica storm panel on her kitchen's south-facing window the first week she arrived, and never explained to her new neighbors why she knew how to do it. She wrote to Letitia twice a year. The letters were short, practical, and completely devoid of sentiment, which was how their friendship had always worked, and which was why it lasted. Letitia Voss Harrow lived in the mountains of Haywood County for the rest of her life. She never returned to Tennessee. She never moved to Waynesville. She stayed in the camp that had tried to expel her, and in the shelter that had saved her, and in the community she had taught to see winter differently. She had 3 children. She repaired mica walls for 20 years. She was not famous. She was necessary, which was better. She died in 1912 at the age of 61 in the expanded shelter that still carried the original 5 bays of cloudy, scarred, twice-repaired muscovite that she had mounted in October of 1880 with hands that shook. The mica had outlasted the woman, which she would have considered correct. Stone was supposed to outlast people. That was the arrangement. On a January night in a mountain camp in western North Carolina, when the wind turned north and the temperature dropped and the cold pressed against every wall in the district like a hand testing a door, the mica wall held. Light came through it in the morning the way it had always come through, amber, filtered, warm enough that the stone behind it remembered the sun. A man who had once called it a glass grave stood in that light and held both hands to the warm granite and said nothing, because nothing was what remained after the mountain had finished answering every question that mattered. Abram Cullowhee had said it plainly, on a trail in October, with the authority of 22 winters and the certainty of a man who had never been wrong about cold. When the wind turns north, he had said, that pretty wall will kill you before dawn. Dawn came. Light reached through mica. The stone behind it was already warm, and the thing they called a grave was the room other people crossed ice to reach. The wall glowed. The mountain did not explain itself. It never had.